When I think about it, the moment that really sparked my morbid curiosity towards dark fiction and true life mystery was when Dr. Cox discovers that the victim of sloth is harrowingly still alive. He's alive! Now, for context, Detective Mills and Somerset are searching for a killer who has committed a series of murders related to the 7 deadly sins, and having seen countless film noirs that inspired my own writing and filmmaking, I was shaken by this scene in a way that made me question just how normalized our perception of realism truly is. In other words, I find Seven to exemplify this visual stereotype in cinema, where we start to consider something realistic just because it has a dense, gritty, and gloomy atmosphere. In a way, we've cultivated this misinformed perception, whether intentional or not, that realism equates to hopelessness, nothingness, and a brooding sense of monotony. And it all comes down to the fact that most of society are just cynical assholes. So let's talk about Seven. Okay, so when was the last time you saw a series of movies that treated realism with actual positivity? And I'm not talking about that tearful bittersweetness that Netflix seems to think are perfectly categorized as feel-good films, the sneaky bastards. We seem to get so caught up on the idea that some things in life are just too good to be true, that we've nihilistically accepted that the world is filled with unfair, tedious obstacles that reinforce our inconsequential existence. I mean, I did warn you this would be quite bleak, considering I opened with sloth of all things. In another way, I think we've become so accustomed to the idea that tragedy is inherently the overriding factor in our lives, that's further compounded by how we search for meaning in more provocative forms of fiction, as opposed to escapism that ignorantly gets overshadowed as some illusion that life can be fun and exciting.
You know, this isn't gonna have a happy ending. Not possible.
Hey man, we catch him, I'll be happy enough.
In the case of Seven, there is more than enough analysis unmasking the depressing reality it presents to find some sort of sanctuary in Somerset's battle with apathy that I want to focus on the bizarre sense of liberation and enlightenment found in embracing deeply uncomfortable, challenging, and more importantly, unconventional ideas. Seven got under my skin in how it uses grotesque fantasy as a way to scrutinize this human condition and desire for constant purpose in everything we do. So much so that it presents a unique take on those Lovecraftian-esque gothic existential style narratives. Grr. What the fuck am I doing with my life? What gets me the most about Sloth and the subsequent other victims is the extremity to which it convinces you of what humanity is truly capable of. The violence hits a certain exaggerative quality you'd assume can only be found in the realm of fiction, but when applied to the realistic conditions of the setting and characters, there is a certain authenticity in its detail that makes it feel somewhat believable. After all, it's even more apparent by the fact that 15 minutes on Reddit or 4chan will expose you to some grisly shit that you never thought was possible anyway, so the internet has pretty much safeguarded this film's fundamental violent absurdity. But more so, Sloth poses a very unique moral question. We have the victim suffering for an inhumane period of time, where without character context would make us sympathetic, as the doctor makes it clear that it's something that even medical professionals struggle to comprehend with. Yet, on the other hand, how much of a damn am I supposed to give for a drug-dealing child molester? His actions and life choices are weighed against that of his suffering, where it points out a selectiveness in our compassion when given access to information or meaning that's previously withheld from us. At the end of the day, it's still the same horrible suffering, but our moral social code conflicts with us having any emotion for him, as highlighted by Dr. Cox's stern emotive response.
You got what you deserved.
Like with New French Extremity, Seven uses body horror not to shock, but instead to push towards this emotional threshold that profoundly affects our relationship with ourself and our physical being, in that our behaviours and lifestyles manifest very personal fears unique to each of us. When it comes to gluttony, pride, and the even more chilling lust, eventually John Doe explains that these were people who took their lives for granted and were driven by what he perceives as human weaknesses. The fears that they have, such as pride having the choice between living with a scarred face or committing suicide, are completely defined by the self, not just the morbid conditions we conventionally assume to elicit fear. It's not about dark, dreary, spooky atmosphere. It's about how their identity and the people they've chosen to be is tied to the horror they endure in their suffering. But John Doe's abrasively philosophical motive isn't exactly justified with a clear sense of reason. When we take on the perspective of Mills, who represents the voice of the audience more than Somerset, because he's the flawed, clumsy cynic who sees the world as black and white, John Doe's well-rehearsed, composed sense of logic is rebuked as purely nonsensical psychopathic jargon because, well, rationally speaking, that's how most of society perceive it to be. Mills and Somerset's relationship reminds me a lot of the comments I get below calling me pretentious or some sort of pseudo-intellectualist who thinks too deeply about things, as if that's inherently a bad thing. Look, when most of us are going about our casual everyday lives, there are others that are in a constant search for meaning to validate our love, hatred, and even fears towards things as menial as a work of fiction. That's what allows us to connect more openly and freely with a world that we keep getting constantly fucking reminded is supposed to be boring and tough. I mean, good God, just live a little, be more adventurous. Where was I again? Somerset is criticised by Mills as reading too laterally into the killer as some cunning scholar who has thoroughly researched and deconstructed his methods and desires, when in Mills' eyes, and by extension many of the other characters who are falling under the same stress and frustrations, he's just a crazy man who defies our social normality. Or more figuratively, Mills represents a human ignorance towards open-minded thinking that he himself, while trying to be open-minded, proves to be more annoyed and cynical in the process. Here's the thing, in fiction we have themes, symbolism, metaphors, and all that pompous subtext that your casual audience might call bullshit on, but that's actually the conflict between Mills and Somerset. One believes people are binary in that they're good or bad, and there's no other complexity behind it, and the other is alienated for trying to think differently to understand the world and the people within it, especially considering the bizarre, unorthodox circumstances of the murder investigation. Somerset is open to experiences that go against a socially constructed cynicism that the world is what it is, which plays into his emotional conflict to see the world as something more enriching and meaningful than what he and others see around him from a blunt perspective. This is where the Lovecraftian existential style theme comes into play. Somerset is so characteristically different in his thinking because he wants to believe in something more, whereas everyone else just wants some sense of resolution, despite what John Doe thinks should be absolution for their own corruptions as the ending reinforces. Granted, it doesn't have to be as deeply divine as John Doe suggests. It's merely about finding a personal coping mechanism during very depressingly dire and uncertain times, or as sociology describes it, a state of anomie, where social standards have collapsed and created a literal instability.
Subway.
It'll go away in a minute.
After all, the narrative arc that we're so traditionally used to, which is to solve the crime, is ultimately stripped away from both detectives and the audience when John Doe just gives himself up, thus igniting a sense of doubt in Mills, who blindly ignores the signs that eventually lead to wrath from his frustrations and dissatisfaction towards an anticlimactic resolve, leaving Somerset with a clarity that there is meaning to be found in a soulless world. In summary, I love SE7EN because it provokes a certain mystique about the world that we constantly overlook. It uses our visual association with everyday life to introduce us to strange and exotic horrors that society rejects just because they aren't seen as realistic in the traditional or common sense. You could say Seven balances along this boundary between raw, untouched, tangible realism and the subjective, emotional reflection of what fear, horror, and moral panic has done to the world. I think by highlighting the forlorn cynicism that's so commonplace among average people, it also defends those who wish to think deeply about the most ordinary or extraordinary circumstances, contrary to their contrived or convoluted state. It's a film presented in two independent mindsets, the one that treats situations and conflicts at face value without losing the same emotional energy of the other perspective, that thinks outside the box and tears it away to uncover the taboo that conflicts with our belief on what rational logic truly is. Seven uses extremity in both violence and thought to grimly express the fact that sometimes you just have to make something as brutally obvious as possible in order to get your point across. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on Seven in the comments below, and if you enjoy what I do here and you want to see this show thrive and survive, please do consider heading over to Patreon, where for just a few dollars a month you can get early access, get your name in the credits, and even more importantly, you can vote on what the next video could be. So please do consider heading over to Patreon and checking that out. And until next time, please follow me over on Twitter and Instagram. And stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!